Thank you, Patrick. I'm always a little bit scared when there's an introduction to me as a speaker. I think Patrick said last night when I gave this presentation in Bedford, he said, we talked to all these people and we've discovered that Everett was the best, so we're going with him. And I was like, oh, set the bar this high, and then I got to come up and speak. So anyway, it's wonderful to be with you all this morning. Is it still morning? It's afternoon, isn't it? Anyway, it's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. It's morning where I come from, and still in Denver. Just to get started, I want to share just a humorous story that kind of leads into where I want to go today. Where we're going to start, we're going to go with a 10,000-foot view of youth ministry and kind of the state of ministry in the church. You're going to discover pretty quickly that I am a big believer that the way we do youth formation in the church is ineffective and obsolete. And that there is a better and easier and even simple way to do ministry that can get real results. And the results that we're looking to get are not more young people in church. If you want more young people in church, throw a kegger. And I mean that as a joke. Don't actually do that. But if that is your bar, like we want young people in church, you can throw a party and young people will show up. It won't lead them to heaven. It won't lead them to salvation. It won't make them more virtuous and whatever else. I mean, but if that's your bar, throw a party. That's not the bar that I have for young people or that the church has. I think that we're all here because we want to make young people real disciples. And so we're going to start with the 10,000-foot view. We're going to do an exercise at your table where you actually start to unpack something. I'm going to give you something to unpack together and discuss. And then we'll discuss it as a larger group, and you'll start to see the goal is to start thinking differently around the problem and the challenge of making young disciples in the year 2024. Patrick mentioned I am from Denver, but I grew up just outside of Chicago. I am a massive Cubs fan. So just fanatical Cubs fan. Love baseball. It's something I enjoy watching in my spare time. And if you know anything about the Chicago Cubs, they're not unlike the Red Sox in that they had a long drought in between championships. So Boston has a long history in baseball with the Red Sox. Chicago Cubs goes all the way back to the 19th century. Your drought was long, and you were under the famous curse of the Bambino, trading away the greatest baseball player ever to the Yankees. And the Cubs had their own curse as well. So it was a big news story in 2016 that the Chicago Cubs won the World Series, breaking their 108-year drought without a World Series victory. So the last time they had won was 1908. And if you guys were under the curse of the Bambino, the Cubs did have their own curse as well. Is anybody familiar with the story of the curse of the Billy Goat? No? Okay, this is much better than the curse of the Bambino. So that one, the curse of the Bambino makes sense. The curse of the Billy Goat, this is a true story. 1945 was the last time that the Cubs had made it to a World Series. They lost that World Series and then never won a pennant again until 2016. And it was said that they would never make it to a World Series ever again because they were under the curse of the Billy Goat. In Wrigleyville, which is the neighborhood that holds or has Wrigley Field in it, which is where the Cubs play, it's a neighborhood, and then there's local bars, and there's very famous places that have been there a long time, one of which is a tavern called Billy Goat Tavern, still there to this day. It's called Billy Goat Tavern because the owner used to keep his pet Billy Goat in the tavern with him. His name was Murph, and he was like an iconic mascot of the neighborhood. And so when the Cubs made it to the World Series, he bought 2 tickets to go to one of the games, one for him and one for his pet goat. And they actually admitted his goat into the stadium and into the bleachers for the baseball game, which you can imagine how well a goat did in a crowd in a room full, like it wasn't a good idea. And so security went up to him or whoever was there and they said, you have to leave with your goat. And he was deeply offended by this, that he was kicked out of Wrigley Field in the World Series. So he wrote a telegram to the owner of the Cubs the next day, and it made it on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, this funny story about getting the goat kicked out of Wrigley Field. And in the telegram, and it was printed in Chicago Tribune, he said to the owner of the Cubs, you will never make it to a World Series ever again because you have offended me and you have offended my pet goat. And so it was this kind of funny ha-ha story. But then as the decades went on, people were like, maybe they really are under a curse. Like they're really bad and they can't seem to win. So in the 1980s, the franchise leaned into this idea that they were under a curse. And every year they would start the season on opening day by parading a goat around the field to try to reverse the curse. There are true stories, and this is absolutely 100% true. They had Catholic priests come into the stadium on multiple occasions and do exorcisms on the stadium to try to lift the curse. There are even more gruesome stories about like beheadings of goats and things that fans did. It was, really awful. I won't get into those details, but the philosophy and the myth behind it, like it was crazy. The one thing they didn't try was putting a good baseball team on the field. Like it's just ridiculous. So 2011 comes around, new ownership takes over the team. By the way, I am going somewhere with this, okay? You're like, we went to this youth ministry thing and the guy just talked about baseball the whole time. 2011 comes around, new ownership buys the team. They want to change the culture around the team. They actually stole Theo Epstein, hired him away from the Boston Red Sox, and the thought was, we have to change everything. And so they tore it all down. They fired everybody. They rebuilt the entire infrastructure of the team, the minor leagues, the development, scouting department, et cetera. And were really bad for several years while they were rebuilding and tearing everything down and rebuilding. But sure enough, by 2016, they had a great baseball team full of great players on the field. But there was this, among the fan base, among the team, there was this attitude of losing. There was this idea of we're under a curse. And they had this brilliant idea. They said, we need to hire someone who brings a culture of winning and a culture of inspiration and gets our team not thinking like they are inevitably going to lose. Last piece of the puzzle they put together, they hired a man by the name of Joe Madden to be the manager of the team, to be the coach. And Joe Madden had a reputation for being a great baseball mind, a player's coach, really fun to play for, and being very quirky. Like he was a great motivator and would use really funny ways to motivate his team. Every year he started the season by printing a t-shirt, making a t-shirt and giving it to them at spring training. It would be their motto for the year. The year they won the World Series, it was try not to suck. You could actually buy this t-shirt at Wrigley Field. It was a Joe Madden-ism. He was famous for canceling batting practices and bringing in things like magicians into the clubhouse or petting zoos or different things to just try to make his team have fun when they were struggling to hit the ball. My favorite story about Joe Madden trying to get his team to think differently and to act differently. The new ownership gutted the locker room and built a whole new state-of-the-art locker room for the team. And they put state-of-the-art equipment in it, state-of-the-art like sports equipment, whatever you need, batting cages and all those kinds of things, computers, and they put great TVs and furniture. It was a fun place to hang out and they said to Joe Madden, they said, if you could have anything else, here's our list of what we're putting in the locker room. What have we forgotten? If you could have anything else you want, what else do you need in the locker room? And Joe said, I need a victory room. And they said, what's a victory room? And they said, well, look at all the nice equipment you're going to get us. Look at all the televisions and different things. He's like, think about the champagne bath when we win the World Series. We're going to ruin everything. And he says, I need a different space for us to go in and celebrate. And they said, wait, you're going to have a room in the stadium that you can only go into once you've won the World Series? And he said, no, we're throwing a party like we won the World Series every time we win a baseball game. They said, wait, hold on a second. And he's like, okay, I get it. Champagne's expensive. We won't do the champagne bath. But like Gatorade and water and celebrations like crazy. He says, we're throwing a party every single time we win a baseball game. And they said, why? And he said, I want my team to look forward to winning. So much so that they fight just a little bit harder so that they can get to the joy of throwing that party. And so sure enough, they did. They built a victory room in Wrigley Field. The team is only allowed in this room for 15 minutes after a victory. If they lose, they can't go in there. And in that room, they've got drains in the floor because they all soak each other down with Gatorade baths and like water and whatever they've got lying around. They've got a DJ booth. They've got a disco ball. They've got smoke machines. And they throw a party every time they win a baseball game. I think it's hysterical. But it just goes to show the kind of thinking you have to do to solve an impossible problem. Now, why did I take the time to share that entire long story? We have a rather significant problem in the church. And I say that almost lightly. I mean, there is actually a cliff that is coming if you look at the data. We are losing young people in the church. That's probably not a surprise to people in this room. In fact, I'm guessing many of you have seen the stats. But if you're not familiar with the stats, the fastest growing religious denomination or religious affiliation in the world today, or in America at least, is the nuns, the non-affiliated, the people who mark that they're spiritual but not religious, or they might be atheist, or whatever the case may be. It is now majority religion among Generation Z. Among Catholics who have left the church and become the nuns and not affiliated, 10% of Americans currently today are former Catholics. Of those that are former Catholics, 79% of them left the church by their 23rd birthday, which means that when we lose people, when people leave the church and no longer identify as Catholic, they do so young. I've seen other stats that have said that of those who have been confirmed, 85% leave the church by age 18. I've seen other stats that have predicted, I don't know how accurate this one is, but of those that were baptized, we're losing 91%. I do know that there is an accurate stat out there that shows that previous generations of Catholics represented about 28 to 29% of Americans among baby boomers and Gen X. But then you get to millennials and it's 18%, and you get to Generation Z and it's 14%. Meaning as baby boomers die off, the younger generations to replace them are not coming up. Like, this is a problem. And it's a rather significant problem. Now, I'm guessing you who work for the church, maybe you know the stats, maybe you don't, but I'm guessing you see it in your everyday life. Like, we're losing more than we're keeping. And this is why I said I'm an advocate and a believer that the way we're doing ministry in the church with young people is not effective. We have to be willing to take what we're doing and say, this isn't working, and therefore we need to blow it up and think differently. That's what I specialize in. Before I get too much further, I want to define a couple of terms. And this is important for the purposes of our work. I'm going to keep using in my presentation the term youth ministry. And I have found when I speak to audiences that the term youth ministry brings up a lot of stereotypes and kind of means different things to different people. For example, when I say the words youth ministry, some people think, oh, that's the ministry that's run by a youth minister. And the reason why I want to get out of that context is because very frequently the budgets of parishes, they say, hey, we will start youth ministry when we can afford a youth minister. And we need to find that person who's going to run this ministry. No, you don't. You don't need a youth minister to do youth ministry. In fact, I would say that the vast majority of parishes that I work with do not have any paid staff who do youth ministry. And you might be thinking, well, think about all the different things you got to do in youth ministry, like the pizza parties and the gatherings where we do games and different things and the youth minister gets up and they give talks, and we do, a youth mass band and praise and worship and whatever else you think of when you think of youth ministry. When I think of youth ministry, I think of a couple of adults sitting around a coffee room table having conversations with young people. Like, it's a very different mentality to what has been traditionally considered youth ministry in parishes for the last 20, 30 years. The word ministry, and this is where I'm going to define terms here. The word ministry, at least the way that I would define it, is meeting the needs of a person. If I were to, that's a broad stroke to make. But think about like ministry in hospitals, ministry to the sick. What do we do in ministry to the sick? We tend to the needs of the sick. And we minister to those needs. Homeless ministry, what do? You try to find shelter and food for those who are homeless. Education ministry, we teach those who are uneducated, and we start to bring them up in terms of their knowledge and understanding of things. And yet our core mission in the church is to go and make disciples of all nations, which is the great commission that Jesus gave us, to baptize those in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So then why do we clothe people and shelter people and take care of their basic human needs? Well, one is because Jesus told us to in the Beatitudes and in his Sermon on the Mount. Two, it's because of the dignity of the human person. Like, people deserve to be taken care of. But three, from a standpoint of evangelization, if you were to meet a homeless man on the side of the road and he's starving and he's asking you for bread, and you sit down with him and you take out your Bible and you open up the bread of life discourse, where Jesus says, I am the bread of life, and unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you. And he encourages in the bread of life discourse for people to feed on the bread that truly nourishes your soul, the bread of life. And you share this gospel passage with him, and then you say, God bless you, and you leave. What did you forget to do? Feed him. Right. If the man is starving, does he care what you have to say? No, of course not. You got to feed him first. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a philosophy of psychology, states that unless a human person's basic needs are met, they never move to a point of self-actualization. So according to Maslow, just to put this into effect, like if you were stranded on a deserted island, like shipwrecked, and the only survivor, Maslow would say that instinctually, you would immediately think, before you get to the point of how do I get off this island, you would think, I need food, water, fire, shelter. Like instinctually, you look for those things first, basic needs. Then once your basic needs are met, you get to a point of self-actualization, which is, okay, how do I get off this island? It's the same thing with all things ministry. And in the case of young people, we have to say, okay, what are their basic needs as a human person? Because if their basic needs are not met, they never get to the point of self-actualization, which is, for us, the moment that a young person says, my faith is not my parents' faith, it's not my priest's faith, it's not my catechist's faith, it's my faith, and I am a disciple of Jesus Christ. According to Maslow, they'll never get to that point unless their basic needs are met first. To which I would argue that basic needs of a human person, they need to be understood, they need to find a sense of belonging, they need to be transparent around faith, and they need to critically think around faith and beliefs, they need guidance. That's another presentation. But I would just say, like, there's basic human needs of a person that we strive to meet. I also want to define the word youth. I define the word ministry. So ministry is meeting the needs of a person. Youth. Young people today, and I think this is fascinating. Youth, you might be thinking, okay, what is a youth? It's like somebody aged 13 to 18. Or maybe it's a broader thing, you encompass young adults in that, you say age 13 to 29 or something. I would argue young people have not always existed. Teenagers have not always existed. And you might say, well, 13 and 19-year-olds have always existed. Of course they have. Yes, but what you think of when you think of a teenager has not always existed. I would say the phenomenon that is a teenager has only existed for about 70 years. Here's what I mean by this. There is a new culture that we have discovered or that has been created in the world. And because of that, it requires a particular approach to be able to evangelize it. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was no such thing as youth. There was childhood and there was adulthood. You grew up as a child, you hit age 11, 12, 13, you get off the lap of your parents and you enter the workforce. You go from childhood to adulthood. Then work becomes more complicated with the Industrial Revolution. Education becomes more accessible. Education becomes something that is longer. And so instead of going to an 8th grade education, you start to see people going through high school education in order to get and be prepared for greater areas of work, more complicated work. And World War II happens, people come home from World War II, and there's this thing in America called the GI Bill, which allowed for anyone who fought in World War II to go to college and be paid for by the government, which was a lot of people. So now all of a sudden, in order to compete with the workforce for high-paying jobs, college becomes more prevalent and more necessary. Nowadays, in 2024, it is not uncommon for this period of adolescence to be extended well into the 30s and sometimes even into your 40s, where you see a young person go through elementary school and then middle school and then high school. Then they go to college for 4 years, sometimes 5 years, sometimes 6 years if they change their majors like twice or 3 times, packing in the debt. Then they might go to grad school to get an advanced education in whatever it is that they're studying. Then they finally graduate and get out of school at age 25, 26. They move back home because they can't afford any place to live. They live in their parents' basement. They have a quarter-life crisis, trying to figure out what it is they want to do. They play video games for a couple of years. They work from home, whatever the case. They've never entered into the world of adulthood by age 30, some of them. They're still searching. I mean, this period gets longer and longer and longer. And with that has become a way of life. Culture means way of life. You look at the 1950s when this started. 1950s, post-World War II, there was this incredible new invention that ended up in the homes of everybody in America that allowed corporations to be able to, for the first time really, advertise their products directly into the home. It was called the television. And one of the things in this economic boom that happened post-World War II, coming out of the Great Depression and out of the war, corporations discovered, you know who has a lot of disposable income and people that like to spend money? Young people. They have after-school jobs, but they live at home. And so all their basic needs are provided for, and they have disposable income. What if we start creating products for the first time in human history that are geared entirely towards teenagers? And so this wasn't just commercials, it was actually built into television shows where teenagers started to act differently than adults. And they started to have their own way of talking that you could see on television shows. They had their own way of dressing that was different than that of adults. They had their different way of acting. They had, you started to see something develop in music called rock and roll, which was specifically advertised to a young generation as, your parents will hate this, and this music is for you. Like, that was strategic and actually really, really damaging to all of human culture. Because the 1960s followed the 1950s. And I always say revolutions start with young people. Like, young people latch on to revolutionary ideas and tend to be the drivers of new ways of thinking and new age of thought. In the 1960s, you had anti-war demonstrations, you had civil rights demonstrations, you had drug revolution, you had sex revolution. By the way, not all these are bad. Like, I'm not anti-civil rights at all, but like, who are the ones driving these ideas? It's the young people. You had Vatican Council II, which was a tremendous ecumenical council, but also carried with it confusion around faith and beliefs in that time period. Then if you look at young people today, what do we see? They're a bit anti-authoritarian. That's what we think of when we think of teenagers. They have their own way of dressing, their own way of thinking, their own way of talking that's different than the world of adults. They've latched onto things like the sexual revolution, drug and peer pressure and revolutions. Like, the very things that those previous generations latched onto has become a new culture. It's a new way of life. All of that is to say, and I took a lot of time to explain this, the approach that we take with young people has to be the approach that we take with a new culture. You cannot, let me demonstrate this, okay? Let's imagine for a second, taking into consideration the history of the church and the way that the church evangelizes. Everybody imagine for a second, a new island is discovered off the coast of Massachusetts that nobody knew existed. And on that new island is a tribe of cannibals. Like, that's their way of life. The church, taking seriously its call to evangelize all nations, says a new tribe has been developed. So they send missionaries to that tribe. Missionaries, that's a common thing in the church. Missionaries were sent here to America when it was discovered, and they evangelized all over the place. That's why half of California is named after Catholic saints, is because of the missionaries. So we send missionaries to the cannibal tribe. And those missionaries, just imagine for a second, they go to the chief of that tribe and they say, we have a better way of living. And we want to introduce you to the person of Jesus Christ, who you've never heard of. And we're going to set up classes to teach you with our catechism and our Bible, 2 books you've never heard of either. And we're going to teach you in a language that you don't understand. And we're going to do our liturgies for you, which is a whole bunch of signs and different things that probably will make no sense to you. What's going to happen to those missionaries if that's their approach with the culture? They're going to they're dead. They're dinner for that night, right? Behind them, the other tribe members are like preparing the spice rack of spices as they're talking to the chief of the tribe. Like, under no circumstance will that approach be effective. But the thing is, a missionary doesn't have that mindset if they're going to be a successful missionary. A good, successful missionary understands that your goal when you go and meet a new tribe is not to become dinner. Your goal is to be invited to dinner. And your goal is to learn the language of the people, to learn their way of life, and then to be able to communicate to them, knowing what that culture understands, picking out what is good and true and beautiful in that culture, and every culture has discovered something that is good and true and beautiful, and using that as a way to communicate the gospel to them. By the way, this is what Jesus did. God quite literally entered into the tribe of human culture, of humanity, and taught us in parables in a way that we would understand and learn to speak our language, and then subsequently walked with us. Jesus was a missionary to humanity. That's what this generation of young people requires. If you go in to this generation of young people with your catechisms, your textbooks, your classes, your prayers, and you say to them, we have a better way of living, they will eat you alive. And some of you who might be catechists are like, yeah, that sounds about accurate. Right? Youth ministry requires an understanding that they are a different culture and a different breed, and they require understanding, and you have to gain their trust, just like a good missionary would. That was a long explanation of what is youth ministry. What is discipleship? This is the other word I'll use. Discipleship, which is a hot buzzword in the church, and I'm glad it's a hot buzzword, but it's also constantly misused. You might hear, I just recently, like a couple weeks ago, was at visiting a parish, and I opened up their bulletin, and it said underneath it, discipleship opportunities. And I was like, oh, this should be good. And I looked under it because I love all things discipleship, and it said, like, become a Eucharistic minister. And then underneath that, it was like, join we need new, like, lectors or different things, or ushers. And I was like, that's not discipleship. I was like, discipleship is not an all-encompassing word for all things catechesis, evangelization, liturgy, worship. That's not what discipleship is a very particular word that refers to a very specific way of formation. In the time of Jesus, discipleship was a common practice where what would happen is a rabbi would come in and evaluate a graduating class of students, and he would handpick maybe one or two students and invite them to be his disciple. And so he would go and evaluate each class of students, and he would say one of two things to each of the students. He would either say to them, go and learn the trade of your father, or he would say, come and follow me. And if he said, come and follow me, you had the opportunity of a lifetime to actually go and be his disciple. And the idea was that a disciple learned from the example of the rabbi. And so the disciple would actually physically live with the rabbi. And they said a good disciple would be covered in the dust of his rabbi at the end of the day, because he was following so close behind the rabbi that the dust from his sandals would be kicked up and covered the disciple. And so the whole idea of discipleship was this idea and concept that you learn from the way of life, from actually observing and imitating the actions of the rabbi. Now consider the apostles for a second. Number one, by the way, have you ever wondered, the first four that Jesus invited, Peter, James, John, Andrew, it says they were in the boat and they were fishing with their father. And it says that after the miracle of the fish, where Jesus has them cast their nets again, and they fished all night and they caught nothing, and they get the catch of a lifetime. And then Jesus says to them, come and follow me. And they actually drop their nets, leave their father in the boat, leave their entire life behind, and go and follow him. Isn't that a strange behavior? Like, wouldn't you say, you know what, I gotta at least put my nets away? Wouldn't you ask a few more questions? It's a strange behavior, except unless you consider it under the understanding of what discipleship is. What are they doing when Jesus finds them?
Their father's job.
Their father's job, the trade of their father. Their opportunity had come and gone. They were not the best of the best. They were not the brightest. They were not handpicked. By the way, they're not even good fishermen. In the Gospels, it always says, it literally always says, unless Jesus is with them, it says they fished all night and they caught nothing. Do you know how bad of a fisherman you have to be to fish all night and catch nothing? Like, they're not even competent in the trade of their father, right? He did not pick the best or the brightest. But he says, come and follow me, which is the invitation to actually go and be the disciple of a rabbi and to live with him. And I kid you not, like, I don't think enough consideration is given to what is not in the Gospels. I have long wondered, what does it look like for God, Jesus, to brush his teeth? Like, what does dental hygiene look like for God? That's not in the Gospels, but they actually got to see it. Like, was he really meticulous with each tooth to like really get everything go? Or was he just like, this doesn't matter, this isn't important, and he would just kind of like swish his mouth with some salt water and be done with it? I don't know. It would have been interesting to know. How did he fold his clothes? What was his prayer routine like? How did he deal with really difficult people? Like, they got to observe those things. And then this is, by the way that God passed on the faith. I find it really curious that Jesus spent his entire time, his entire ministry in Israel. Like, the apostles were the ones who took the faith to Rome and Ephesus and Corinth and Philippi and so on and so forth. God went through the trouble of becoming man, coming all the way to earth to become one of us, always had the intention for the message of the gospel to go out to the entire world, and yet he stays in one place. This little strip of land going up and down at Israel. Because his intention was never for him to be the one to take the gospel to the world. It was for the apostles to do so. So he poured himself into these 12. And then, when the church got started, post-Pentecost, and the apostles go to Rome and Philippi and Corinth and so on and so forth, they didn't stay there and preach in the temple for a couple of weeks, start the communities and leave. They lived there for years. And the early Christians learned from their way of life, which they learned from Jesus. That's how the faith was passed on in previous generations. At some point, we lost that concept. Discipleship is key. I will say it's so key. Here's what I've discovered about discipleship. So a little bit of my background. Patrick mentioned I've been in youth ministry for 18 years. I would say I spent the first 5 years building big, huge, successful youth ministry programs from scratch that were considered really successful. And then I spent the last 13 years unlearning all of that. The first 5 years, I built 4 years, I was in a small parish in Florida, working to build a youth ministry at a parish that had never had it before. We had no budget. I had to fundraise my entire organizational budget. I had nothing to work with. By the time I left there, we had a youth ministry that was the largest and considered the most successful in the diocese. So, it was successful. So successful, in fact, that I got recruited to a large parish in Colorado, where I took over an underperforming youth ministry. And I'm not saying this to brag, but I had everything I could possibly want that I didn't have in Florida. I had an amazing volunteer team that was like multiple theologians on the team and people who had ministry backgrounds. And I had a great worship band. And I not to brag, I had a $250,000 budget. Yeah, I know. We had multiple youth ministers on staff. Yeah, so I had no excuses, we'll put it that way. And yet there was something off in the ministry. So I had a moment in 2010 where I was sitting at my desk planning the next series of youth groups that we were going to do and the next topics. And I looked at a picture on my desk of a group of 100 teens that I'd taken to a student conference 3 years prior. And it was this group in Florida when I was still working there. And I realized that 3 years later, only 10 out of 100 were still practicing their faith. And my youth ministry was really successful. And the thing is, like, even in Colorado, where I had everything I could possibly want, I was seeing the same superficial results. See, I was a follower of Christ. I knew what followers of Christ looked like. And I knew that something that we were doing was missing. I was deeply troubled by this. 2 days later, Patrick name dropped Jim Beckman. Jim Beckman's a mentor of mine, and I was out to lunch with Jim Beckman, who was a 25-year veteran of youth ministry, built big, huge, successful youth ministries. And Jim has this really annoying way of being prophetic in my life, which I hate, because he just kind of knows things that God has told him, and he just picks at you with it. And so we were out to lunch, and he's like, "How's everything going?" And at this point in time, I wasn't willing to admit that something was wrong to somebody, even though I was deeply troubled by this. And I was like, "Oh, Jim, everything's going great. Our numbers are way up. I've got everything I could possibly want. I got a $250,000 budget." I'm like, we're going to World Youth Day this summer. We've got all this stuff planned. And he's like, oh man, that all sounds great. How many of the kids in your program do you think will become lifelong followers of Jesus Christ? And I was like, well, Jim, there's no way for me to know that. Like, it's the different soil. There's the fertile soil and there's the rocky soil and something about weeds. And, he's like, you're right. That's an unfair question. You can't predict that. Your parish in Florida, how many of those kids became lifelong followers of Jesus Christ? And in my mind, I'm thinking like, are you reading my diary? Like what is going on? And I started to hear myself say, all the excuses I hear in ministry circles about why we're losing young people to church. And I said, well, Jim, it's not about the numbers. And parents are so difficult. If they just prioritized the church, but they prioritize sports and everything else ahead of the church, and they don't really take their faith seriously. I don't know why they're dropping their kids off at church. Like they don't take it seriously. If they did, it doesn't make sense. Why would they be bringing their kids to church if there wasn't something important there? And man, like Jim, like my pastor, he's so difficult to work with. And like, if I just had more volunteers and oh man, like if I just had a bigger budget, I had a $250,000 budget. I actually heard myself say, if I just had a bigger budget, I could do more. And he called me on it. He's like, stop making excuses. Just take a guess. And I said, Jim, I don't have to guess. It's 10 out of 100. Please don't tell my pastor. And this started a conversation that really changed my life in terms of the way I thought around ministry. And he very simply asked, he said, well, what'd you do with the 10 that you didn't? I told him about the picture. He said, what'd you do with the 10 that you didn't do with the other 90? And I said, well, I had this like leadership team that I worked with that they would help me put on the confirmation retreat. But really, like, in order to be on that team, you had to do Bible study with me every week. I mentored their prayer lives. I spent the majority of my relational ministry time with those teens. I got to know their families, and I really ministered to their families. And still to this day, I'm friends with their families. I ministered to their wounds. I got to know what their individual obstacles were in their life and their wounds, and ministered to those wounds and healed them. And the other 90 went through my program. It was dynamic, incredible catechesis. And he's like, oh, you know what you're describing that you did with those 10? That's called discipleship. I was like, oh, that's what that is. And he says, yeah. He says, so what you just identified is that the difference between success and failure is that those who were discipled became lifelong followers of Jesus Christ. And those who weren't became really well-programmed former Catholics. And I was like, oh, okay. He says, so what you're saying then, Everett, is that in order for you to be successful in ministry, you have to disciple everyone in your parish. And I said, whoa, time out. Did you just hear what I did with those 10? Like, that took so much time. He says, yeah, but you just identified that's the difference between success and failure. So we started to talk about, well, what would it look like? What would be required? And we came up with, at least in 2010, a novel idea. It's not novel anymore. Thanks be to God, it's getting momentum. But the idea was, okay, like, I can only mentor and really disciple a handful of people. But if I find others who are capable of doing the same thing in my pews and train them, and we kind of meet in these small groups throughout the week, it would, potentially we could disciple more people. It was stupid simple. We simplified our youth ministry down to, rather than one big, large youth group that was doing all these dynamic things that really weren't making a difference and required a ton of my time and work, to small groups where I mentored the mentors, and all throughout the week, they would meet in comfortable locations, and they would mentor the teens. We found the faithful Catholics in the pews, and we put young people in relationship with them. And that's what I've been doing for 13 years. I could take a guess. I will tell you this, our youth ministry within a year tripled in size. The young people flocked to it. Why? Because their needs were being met. The other thing that I will say is that I noticed that our young people stayed involved and actually remained active Catholics. And I could have taken a guess as to what the percentage was, but I'll tell you an interesting anecdote and story. One of my first clients that I worked with when I started consulting on this method of ministry is a high school named Dowling Catholic High School in Des Moines, Iowa. And they had a concept. They said, we want to take discipleship. And actually, they originally reached out to Focus, and they said, we want Focus in a Catholic high school. And Focus says, we do colleges, we don't do high school. But we know a guy. And they introduced him to me. And I said, well, I work with parishes. I don't work with high schools. And they said, well, can we try it? And I said, sure. And so I went in and I helped them hire somebody, and we the goal was to find some adult mentors in the community and find a few teens that might start a small group or two. And we got, I think, 4 small groups going in the first couple of months that I worked with them, and I trained them, et cetera. I think last year they told me what their numbers are up to. And they said at the end of the last school year, they had 70 small groups going. They had over 400 students participating. It's not mandated. It's not mandatory at all. The students are voluntarily participating. And what I really found interesting is they were so interested to see what the results were of the work that they were doing in terms of mentorship with teens in these small groups. And so they hired a third-party firm to follow their students through college in a 4-year study, surveying their practices and seeing how many of them were still active Catholics. And to be an active Catholic, you had to be praying every day, you had to be going to Mass weekly, you had to be involved in your campus ministry in some capacity, like you had to be active in your practices. Do you know what they found? They found that those students who went through their typical theology courses and offerings and their typical campus ministry offerings, but were not part of a small group, half of them left the church by their first year of college. 48% were no longer active Catholics after 1 year of college. Do you know what the percentage was of active Catholics after 1 year of college? Anybody want to take a guess? Of those who were discipled? Anybody want to take a guess percentage-wise? What was the success rate? You said 60? What was it? 90? We got a 60, we got a 90. Anybody else? 80? So you're all guessing too low. Well, it wasn't 100. I mean, even Jesus didn't get 100. He lost Judas. So it's 95%. 95%. Even after 4 years of college, 2 of those being COVID years, which were really irregular, it was 79% after 4 years of college. And they're saying they're actually seeing that trend up. Like they're getting better at discipleship, and as a result, they're seeing that the 79% is becoming more like 80s, et cetera. It is very common right now that their alumni come back to the high school and are now mentoring students. In fact, I will actually say, just as a bragging thing, I will brag about this. Their most high-profile alumnus who came out of this program, who was invited to speak at the Eucharistic Congress about her Catholic faith and declined because she was very busy, is a sports star by the name of Caitlin Clark. Came out of Dowling Catholic High School in the Ut Fidem program, which means keeping the faith. She is a faithful Catholic. Her family is very involved with the program. Her brother was actually the first student that they invited to be in one of the small groups. He was captain of the football team, and he's now back in the program as a mentor. By the way, every time I see an ESPN SportsCenter highlight of Caitlin Clark, and I see her getting mad at the refs, I'm like, oh, please, you're an ambassador of the Catholic faith. Like, keep your cool, stay calm, you know? But it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to see. Just the results that they're getting. I would have guessed in my own ministries about 80 to 85%. Like, we're seeing that kind of success rate. Discipleship is not complicated. It's possible. You're capable of doing it. Here's what I'll say about discipleship, and then we're going to do an exercise. And I want you to, we're going to actually, rather than teaching you about all things discipleship, which honestly I could do in several days, we're going to do an exercise just to start to get you thinking a little bit differently about blowing up your own ministries. And it's not that difficult. It's not that much work. But it does require a difference of the way we're thinking. Jesus thought differently. He did not have the typical mentality when it came to reaching the masses. If you look at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, arguably one of his greatest sermons ever given, takes up several chapters of Matthew's gospel. Nowhere in the Sermon on the Mount does it say that anyone who heard the Sermon on the Mount became a follower of his, which I find really fascinating. In fact, I would actually argue that if anything, they might have been turned off by what he said, because they were expecting a Messiah who would call them to arms, lead them to war, deliver them from their oppressors. And in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, love your enemies. They were expecting a Messiah who would say, kill your enemies. And he says, love your enemies. And he called them, he lost the crowds frequently. I would actually argue, at the risk of sounding like a heretic, and I know this is on video, so please don't show this to Cardinal O'Malley. No, I don't think this is heresy, but I would say that Jesus' large group ministry was a failure because the crowds eventually turned on him and had him killed. I don't think Jesus was ever really focused that much on the crowds. He was, but I believe Jesus came here for the 12. And even among 12, there was 3, and even among 3, there was 1. I want to give you an idea of the divine plan to conquer the entire world. And there was a divine plan to conquer the entire world. God did not look out into the masses and ask himself the question, how am I going to reach all of these people? Instead, he looked out into the masses and he singled out Simon the fisherman, and he asked himself the question, how am I going to make him into St. Peter? And then once he figured that out, he moved from 1 to 3, and 3 to 12, and 12 to 72, and so on and so forth. I call this the theory of 1. I believe if you're actually going to be successful in ministry and build the church, we should be focused on the work of making 1 saint. And if you do that, you'll have a greater impact on the world than 1,000 mediocre Catholics. Look at John Paul II. Would anyone argue that John Paul II didn't have a tremendous impact on the world? Look at Mother Teresa. Would anyone argue that Mother Teresa didn't have a tremendous impact on the world? See, movements of the Holy Spirit start small. Franciscans, who are all over the world, started with Francis and a few brothers. Mother Teresa started with a couple of other women. You look at movements like Life Team, which started with 3 people in 1 parish. Focus started at 1 college campus with 4 missionaries. In fact, anytime I see a large ministry start with a large vision, I get immediately skeptical. Because the way that God works is he works small and actually reaches more people by doing so. I didn't tell this story last night, but you said I had an extra 30 minutes here, so I will. Patrick, the story of, has anybody ever heard the story of Jan Taranowski? Okay, the priests have. Thanks be to God, I'm glad. His story is getting out there now, which is great to see. But I believe Jan Taranowski had one of the greatest impacts on the history of the 20th century. His cause is being studied right now for canonization. He's a servant of God. He was just a random guy in the pews. So he was like you and me. His job was he was a tailor. And he had a reputation for being a holy and pious man, but no different than any holy or pious man that's in the pew or anybody that's striving to be holy. When the Nazis invaded Poland in the 1930s, one of the things that they shut down is they shut down all youth programs. It became illegal to meet with young people in a program setting because they knew that, like I said, revolutions start with young people, and they knew that in order to stop people from rising up against them, they outlawed youth programs. One of the things that they did. So all youth programs in parishes that were taught by priests were shut down. It was illegal. And Taranowski said, you know what's not illegal? Is dinner in my house. And he singled out 5 young men in their early 20s, and he invited them over to his house for dinner. And I don't know that he didn't have a program or anything that he took them through, but his holiness and piety rubbed off on them. He had a strong devotion to Mary, and he had a huge love of Carmelite spirituality, in particular St. John the Cross. Eventually, he challenged the 5 young men to work with younger high school boys each. He said, Jesus has 12, you should have 12 too. And they would meet in secret out in the woods on like camps and on hiking trips with these group of 60 young men. They became known as the Living Rosary, a clandestine youth ministry. All started by Taranowski, but all started with just around his dinner table of him nonchalantly, informally ministering and discipling 5 young men. Of those 60, 10 of them became Catholic priests. But not only that, not only did 10 become Catholic priests, one of them became a pope. One of the original 5 that Taranowski ministered to was a young man by the name of Karol Wojtyla, who's St. John Paul II. In the book, Witness to Hope, I believe, this is where the quote comes from, but one of the priests who was ordained alongside of Wojtyla, who was also one of the original 5, he said, Taranowski's influence on Karol Wojtyla was gigantic. I can safely say, if it were not for Taranowski, neither myself nor Wojtyla would have become Catholic priests. If you look at the mantra, the papal motto of John Paul II is Totus Tuus Maria. He learned his Marian devotion both from his parents, but also from Tyranowski. And if you look at Kirill Wojtyla's studies, he earned 2 doctorates because he was a genius, one in philosophy, one in theology. His theological doctoral dissertation he wrote on the spiritual works of St. John the Cross, who he learned to love from Tyranowski. And actually, if you look at the papacy of John Paul II and his life, he gives great witness to Christ within suffering. And if you look at John the Cross in his Dark Night of the Soul, it talks about finding Christ within suffering. Tyranowski formed a saint, a single saint, one, who changed the entire world. Tyranowski was no different than the people in the pews like you and me. That's the impact of one. That's the impact of discipleship.